Welcome everybody on Zoom. Welcome everybody in the lecture hall. Welcome everybody from the future. Today we are going to continue talking about syntax, what you see right here, and then we'll move on to white column stores. You can find the slides on the Moodle, right? So where did we stop? I motivated the whole thing with syntax with the notion of denormalized data, that we need to be able to transmit and store denormalized data. We saw that there is the JSON syntax and the XML syntax. Technically, they're the same in the sense that it's trees, as I would like you to notice this and next week, right? So I showed you the syntax, but I had a few more things to show you on the XML side, right? So one of them is just what is an acceptable name for an element or an attribute. And here it's pretty simple because it's pretty much what you're used to with programming languages. For example, if you use Java or Python, you probably know that you cannot start the name of a variable with a digit, right? It has to be a letter first and so on. So it's a little bit the same here, right? So on the top, this is not allowed. You cannot have special symbols. You cannot start with the digits. But as long as it starts with a letter or an underscore is fine too, just like in Java or C++, then you're going to be fine. One thing you should know is that you shouldn't start your element and attributes names with XML, uppercase or lowercase. It's not that it's forbidden, it's just that it's reserved by the W3C. So only people in the W3C are authorized to create these elements. So you shouldn't, but do not be surprised if Oxygen accepts it, because it doesn't know if you might be in the W3C, right? Maybe you have the right to do it. So it's just forward compatible, but you shouldn't make up anything that starts with XML. And here I summarized what you can do. So all the letters of the alphabet plus the underscore can come first. So mark in green with a white font, in red with black font, that is what is not allowed at all. And then in blue, these are the digits, and the dot, minus, and colon. These you can have, but not to start with, right? Everybody hear us on Zoom? I see activity in the chat. Yes. There is sound, right? Okay, everybody has sound otherwise. All right, very nice. Okay, so this is the idea. So pretty simple. It starts with letter or underscore. Then you can have digits, dot, dash, and colons. All right. Now, what about the spacing? When you probably noticed in JSON and in XML that you can pretty much indent things in any way you want, but the reason is just for us humans. It just makes it easier to look at for a human being when it's not the one element per line like this. But technically, the computer doesn't care. You could have everything on the same line, it would be the same. So you can really do that without any problem. In fact, in Oxygen, you can even press some combination of keys that magically indents, and it's called pretty printing, this thing, because it looks pretty when you do it. So you can just pretty print any XML and JSON document, and you're doing yourself a favor as a human being. All right, so just to say that it doesn't matter the namespace in general, and you can totally do that. Now, I would like to introduce something that hasn't yet made its way into JSON, but it has into XML, and this is something that is necessary when you define a lot of things. You probably know the notion of packages in Java, the notion of namespaces in C++, even in it's tidying up, right? You basically organize everything you create into namespaces. Well, we kind of want to do the same thing with element names and attribute names. We also want to put them in namespaces, and so I'm going to show you how that actually works, right? So it was introduced a bit later, but today it's considered to be part of XML, so it has to work in this way. All right, so the idea of why we need them is that we might be joining two data sets from different sources, and these data sets might have collisions in names. For example, you might have a customer relationship data set and a computer network data set, and then you might have clients on both sides, right? But of course, in the one case, a client is a computer, and in the other case, it's a human being, right? So it's kind of colliding when you try to query, and that can really be making your querying more difficult. So you need namespaces to nicely sort that, like one is a computer network context, the other one is a customer relationship management context. So the idea is that just like people can have the same first names, then you can differentiate with last names, right? Of course, in practice, you can still have two persons with same first and last name, but with namespaces, you really can't. So you have a namespace plus a local name, And that gives you the full identification of an element name. It's really the same as a class in Java has a package plus the name of the class, right? In Python, you have a module, and then you have the name of the function. In C++, you have namespaces, then you have the name of the class or the function. It's exactly the same thing. But there is one thing that might sound confusing at first, is that since it's a W3C specification, and these are the same people who designed the web, HTML, HTTP, they love URLs that start with HTTP. So guess what? They thought, okay, let's use URLs for URIs for namespaces. So this is why you see all of these HTTP blah, blah, blah for namespaces, but this has nothing to do with websites. This is really just, remember the REST API, everything is a resource. So a namespace is a resource, and that's why it's called that way. So it sounds confusing, but it's really not. It's just like in Java, you have ch.ethz blah, blah, blah for the package names based on the domain. Here, they just more explicitly use a URL, right? Okay, so this is an example of a mathematics library that's called MathML. Actually, it exists. And in that case, there's an element called EQ for equals. You compare two numbers. So the local name is EQ, and it's living in the namespace MathML, right? So www.w3.org. / blah, 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 / mathml. Now, if you define your namespaces, you should probably define them with a domain that you own, right? Nobody would prevent you otherwise, but you're basically preventing collision with other people. So you should create namespaces with a domain that belongs to you. All right, so now, if it's incredible, everything is on strike. Last week, this week, everything is breaking. All right, so now you might think, okay, let's put the namespace in there in XML and put the URL of the namespace everywhere. Then it's very clear that we have the local name on the right, and then in the curly braces, we have the namespace. Of course, that's very ugly, and we are lazy. We computer scientists, I'm one of them too. We are lazy, we don't like to repeat things. So what we do is that we take a shortcut. Instead of writing every time the URL, we only write it just once, we write it on the top with a declaration like this. And what we do is that we associate this namespace here for all of my MathML elements. I associate it with the prefix M. And then everywhere I use that prefix M to say that all of these are in fact in the MathML namespace. So it means that apply is a mathematical thing, EQ2, and so on, right? It's like a LaTeX, but in XML. So what happened here? It looks like an attribute, but it's not an attribute. Why? Because it starts with XML. And I told you, you are not allowed to start any attribute or element with XML on your own. But in that case, this is a special thing. It's not an attribute, it's a namespace binding that binds this namespace to the prefix M, and then you can use the prefix everywhere. For whom is that clear? All right, and again, keep in mind that you do the same thing in Python, in Java. Whenever you import a module, you import a package, that's exactly the same idea, right? And then you use the shortcuts to the, I think even in Python, you do that, right? You reuse just the end of the path to identify the function you want. All right, so now I'm just going to get slightly more in depth, but without scaring you too much, to explain a bit more about the mechanism. The prefix binding works like this, that you always have these XMLNS things, and then the colon is a special character, and then you have the prefix that you bind it with, right? So the idea is that this defines a binding between a prefix and a namespace, in that case, M to the namespace. It's only a shortcut. The prefix is actually totally irrelevant semantically. Nobody cares about the prefix. It's just some temporary name that you give to the namespace that is much shorter. And then within the XML document where you have this binding, you have the right to use the prefix for the namespace, right? So this is how it works. In that case, there's an example where math here, the elements is associated is in namespace M, right? So this is how it works. So now we have the prefix M on the left of the column in the element name. And then we have what's called the local name on the right. That would be math in that case. It's a mathematical document. And then the namespace, right? So what happens is that when you parse, when the parser opens the XML document, it's going to see that the element is called mmath. It's going to look for the namespace bindings. It sees that there is one right here, XML NSM. So it knows that the prefix M is associated with that namespace. So it resolves it. And now you have this triple prefix local name namespace that uniquely identifies your elements. This is called a qualified name or QName, as a lot of people abbreviate that in XML. So this is called a QName, and a QName is made of a prefix, a local name, and a namespace. So far, so good? Okay. Now, one more thing. Semantically, I repeat, the prefix doesn't matter. The only thing that really matters is the namespace and the local name. So to compare for equality, to know if two QNames are the same, you only compare the namespace and the local name. If the prefixes are different, it doesn't matter. It's the namespace and the local name, like the family name and the first name of a person with the analogy. So it means concretely that these two QNames here are the same logically, right? They are the same QNames. Why? Because the namespace is the same. The local name is the same. You can see that one was using the prefix foo and the other the prefix bar, but this is totally irrelevant. They are still equal. For whom is that clear? All right, I'm slow with this because it's every year it's a bit a tough part. So this is how it works. So yes, go ahead. Oh, over there. Yeah.
Can you have the same prefix? I mean, yeah, can you have the same prefix but different namespaces?
You can't. So you can only bind, at least in a certain scope, every prefix must be mapped to exactly one namespace, right? You can overwrite, but I'm going to show you shouldn't, because I'm going to present you a very simple way of doing it. And I'm going not to go too much into advanced details, which technically are not very useful. But to answer your question very clearly, in any scope, a prefix is only associated with one namespace, and that's it, right? But nobody would prevent you from associating the same namespace to several prefixes, right? It's bad practice. It's not a good idea, but technically nobody would complain about that. And you shouldn't do it. Technically, if you do a one-to-one thing, one prefix, one namespace, that's tidy and that's good, right? Does it make sense? Awesome. So now, what I'm saying is that these two documents are logically the same document, because it doesn't matter if it's M or if it's foo, only the prefix is different, but the namespace is the same. So these are the same documents. All right. So now, and again, I'm repeating things, all of these are the same, because the only things that I change between these elements is the prefix. It's always the same namespace. It's always the same local name. I just gave like different prefixes, right? Do you agree these are all the same? Who agrees? Okay. Did you see the last one at the bottom? It's a bit special. It's a bit different than the others. This is because in the last one, you're being so lazy that you don't even want a prefix. This is the laziest you can ever be. And in that case, it's called the default namespace. So this is when you just do XML and S. So you say, okay, by default, anything that doesn't have a prefix lives in my mathml namespace. So it means that the fifth element here is also the same as the others. It's just that the last one uses the default namespace mechanism. But logically, these 5 elements are exactly equal to each other, logically. All right? Okay. So this is the default namespace right there that I marked as such. Now, it means that this document right here is also the same as, if it clicks, this one. What did I do here? I just dropped the prefix and used the default namespace mechanism instead. So I'm declaring the default namespace to be w3.org, blah, 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 mathml. What that means is everything that doesn't have a prefix is in that namespace. Do you agree that these documents are terrible? This document, okay, this document here is the same document as this document. Who agrees? Right? Just in one case, I use a prefix, and in the other case, I use the default namespace. But it's not the same as this one, because in this one, there is no namespace at all. In fact, this document is what we saw until now. Before I even introduced namespaces, this is the sort of documents we would have. But in that kind of document, it's even simpler. You don't even have any namespace at all. So if you look at these elements, they have a local name. They don't have a prefix. They don't have a namespace, right? So technically, this kind of document is great if you want to play with XML. You just want to play around and have some fun with it. from the moment you are a company, you create elements, you go in production with your XML documents, you should have a namespace. It's just to make it production proof, you should really have namespaces. But this is typically when you start with XML, this is the sort of things that you see, right? Okay. So now you can also have multiple namespaces in the same document. Now that shouldn't surprise you, right? In Python or in Java or in C++, you can also import multiple modules and use them, right? It's not very different. So you can also declare multiple namespaces, all at the top right there. Bar and foo are the two prefixes, and one is attached to some fake namespace that I invented, example.com/bar, and the other is example.com/foo. Yes? Almost? Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask what's the advantage of namespaces. So you mentioned that before you go into production, you definitely need to have a namespace, but you can also have the schema for validation. What's the advantage of a namespace?
So the schemas work with namespaces as well. You can basically define a schema that has the list of all the elements in the namespace. And technically, you can create one schema file for every namespace, right? So you can have a customer relationship management schema, you can have a computer network schema, a MathML schema, and so on. And then you can use these schemas to validate these elements right here, right? So that might come with a schema for these two namespaces. So it's not either or, it really plays together. But the reason for namespaces is really to keep things tidy. Imagine that you would do Java, use Java or C++, and you don't put anything in any namespace. You just put all the classes with their names out there without any packages. You realize that that would be messy, right? There would be collisions. It's exactly the same thing here. We just want to very nicely tidy things up and categorize and classify all of the elements that we declare. We want to nicely organize them in a namespace, right? So this is the idea. And this is exactly what we do with elements, is exactly what we do with classes and functions in any programming language, right? It's just a matter of organizing things, right? Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Awesome. So now, in that case, just like I could have two modules imported in a Python file. Oh, we have another question. Go ahead.
Yeah. What would be the equivalent of this in JSON?
There is none yet, but technically it's not entirely true because there are many JSON dialects that do have namespaces. I will give you examples even a bit later in the semester. So there exists some JSON formats, and I have an example in business reporting for the financial reports, for example, submitted to the SEC in the US. The JSON, the namespaces are not used in a way that is standard JSON worldwide, but it's for the use case. What that means is that, because in that case, this is something with governments and 10,000 companies, right? So they realize that without namespaces, it just doesn't work, and you need to really classify everything that you report. So this is really let me put it that way. JSON is more recent than XML. It hasn't been there for as long, and so it has not yet introduced that kind of mechanism, or at least standardized, right? But it is really part when you have syntaxes like this, you need namespaces to categorize, right? Does it make sense? Yeah. It's really, I would say, the difference. You start hitting these things when you work with thousands of companies and the government, and you need something enterprise ready. This is when you start feeling the need for namespaces. If you're just playing around with a few files, then you will not feel that need, right? It's really for scaling up, I would say, right? Okay, so in that case, I have two namespaces associated with two prefixes, and that grants me the right to use them wherever I want in the file. So some of them have the prefix bar, some of them have the prefix foo, and that puts them automatically in that namespace. Now, it's easy to get things very messy, but I'm going to keep it extremely simple for you. Just put your namespaces in the root element, period. Always do that. That keeps it tidy. So it means it's right there. There's all of your namespace binder in the root element, and that's it. One prefix for one namespace, do it as a bijection, really, and that keeps your life simple. Extra tidy, which I love, put it in the alphabetical order of prefixes. This is better, right? Then you can use all the prefixes in the document, right? So this is really what I recommend. And another thing that some people tend to be doing in practice is, even though the prefix doesn't matter, in practice, and I'm again taking the example of the financial reports in the US, it's still a good idea to try to agree on prefixes, but this is really for us humans to keep our sanity. If a namespace tends to be used a lot with a certain prefix, it's a good idea if everybody does the same, because then if you start using different prefixes, you're just confusing humans. The computers will not be confused, right? They will be totally fine with that, but it's easier for us humans to try to stick to some convention. All right, so try to use them consistently. But of course, if other people didn't, you need to be prepared for that. So for example, here we had the namespace example.com/foo is associated with prefix foo here and with prefix f here. That should be fine. You just understand that the prefix is irrelevant and it's the same document. Right? Okay. Now, a note about default namespaces. I highly recommend you do not mix them with prefixes, because you could technically in the same document have a default namespace plus 4 prefixes, right? I don't recommend that. It's going to, again, confuse things. So the one use case where you should use the default namespace is if everything is in that namespace. In that case, all the elements are in that namespace. It's a good idea to use the default namespace. It makes the document a bit less overloaded visually, right? But as soon as you have multiple namespaces, you should just use a prefix for each one of them and do not make any namespace the default, right? This is also for your sanity. So these are really just best practices, right? So again, here I'm repeating, do not confuse these two things where on the right, the elements are in no namespace at all. This is kind of the debug mode of XML when you just play around with documents. And on the left is an enterprise-ready document where everything is in the default namespace, nicely organized in that, and you avoid collisions, right? Okay. So now, to summarize the best practice that I recommend to you, do not do anything else than what you see on the screen right there. It means that you could have no namespace at all if you just play and debug locally and so on. You can have one default namespace for the entire document. You could have one prefix namespace. This is fine too. It's kind of equivalent. Or you can have multiple namespaces with each their prefix. You see, it's alphabetically sorted here. I did it very tidy. And then all of these prefixes. These are the 4 cases. These 3 are enterprise ready, large scale ready, and this one is okay too, but probably not in production. Okay? For whom does that make sense? Right? And this is it. This is just the way you should be using them. You can, of course, do things more messy, but you shouldn't. Yes, there is a question over there. Small hops, not. Yeah, I need to be careful. Okay. Great.
Thank you. I do have a question. For the one default namespace, can't we actually use elements that are in no namespaces? I'm not talking about the default, but can't in the second case, when there is only one default namespace, to use elements that are not in a namespace, like HTML, for instance?
So you can't, basically. From the moment you define the default namespace, you can no longer have any elements that are in no namespace, right? Because from the moment you put that XML and S, that's it. You declared the default namespace, right? Now, you could have some, if you really do it in an advanced mode and try to, do things that are not on that screen, you might manage, but I really recommend you don't. Because again, you're going to confuse yourself, you're going to confuse people. So the best practice is to stick to that. Either everything is in that namespace or everything is in no namespace at all, right? If you want to use multiple namespaces, you should use that. Mixing elements in no namespace with elements in a namespace, I would say I wouldn't call it enterprise ready, basically. You shouldn't be doing that. You can, but you shouldn't. Okay? Ideally, in an enterprise-ready configuration, everything is in a namespace. All the elements are in a namespace. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Wow. All right. So this is an example of the messy things you can do. Don't. I can't be clearer than that. Do not do that. What's on the screen. You can, but please don't. So this is why I'm not going to explain what that actually means. It's just different scopes. Okay. What about attributes? Well, attributes, they're a little bit special because attributes, typically, you can have them, they work a bit differently. If an attribute doesn't have a prefix, it's always in no namespace, right? So the attributes will not inherit the default namespace. It's really because if you use elements that are already classified in namespaces, it will not really cause any trouble if the attributes that you have on them don't have namespaces, right? So this is why when you have an unprefixed attribute, it does not absorb the default namespace. It's really always in no namespace. You can, of course, also use these prefixes on attributes. That's fine too. In fact, some people do that. The only thing you need to be careful about is because the prefix is irrelevant. In that case, I did something very bad that you shouldn't do. I bounced the same namespace to two different prefixes, but that's only to show that point. Then you happen to have twice the same attribute name, right? But you remember that you cannot have twice the same attribute name in the same elements, right? But now, do you agree that these two names are the same because it's the same namespace? Who agrees, right? So this is why you can't do that. But the reason why you shouldn't worry too much about that is that I anyway told you that doing that is bad. Do not bind the same namespace to two prefixes, right? So the only goal of that slide is really just to make the points, but if you really follow the instructions here, you will not have that problem. Okay. Now, this is an exercise that I left for anybody who wants to train, and this is a good exercise to play with Oxygen. So try to take that document and spot all of the mistakes in there. And you might actually spot a few. Can anybody see some of them? Yes? Yeah, be careful. Maybe we can. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask in the previous slide. In this case, we are not using the default namespace, but if we are using, for example, the default, or maybe one slide before, where we talked about the when an attribute has no namespace, has no namespace, but we are using the default namespace. Would you then, for example, define a prefix for the additional names for the namespace so that we can then define for the attribute the prefix so that it's part of the default namespace?
Technically, you could, but again, you shouldn't. Because if you start doing these things, it starts being so complicated that you should just not have any default namespace and just bind everything to a prefix, right?
Okay.
So I really recommend you only use the default namespace if it's very clear that that's the only namespace you have in your document, right? Then the elements would be in that default namespace and the attributes in no namespace. From the moment that you want to merge in the same document, use several namespaces, just use prefixes everywhere, right? That's the idea. Does it make sense?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. So now you know about namespaces. I annoyed you with them because, again, even though it seems like they are not in JSON, as soon as you get enterprise-ready JSON, who comes back? The namespaces, also in JSON. All right, so now you know how that works. And again, the mental model you should have is exactly like packages in Java, modules in Python, namespaces in C++, with functions. It's just that now we do it with elements. Okay. All right, so here, who can spot? Just let's spot at least two mistakes here. Who sees them? Yes, go ahead, without microphone, that's okay. The
upper one is lowercase and the other one has an uppercase.
Yep, you're correct. And it's case sensitive. So indeed, this is incorrect. That's a mistake. A second one, yes? The comment, yes? Here, yeah. Up, here, yeah. Yeah, so there is exactly, this is forbidden, right? This is another thing that's forbidden, all right? Very good, and there's a few others. Do you want to tell me the others? Yes, go ahead. Let me find it. Title, yes, exactly. That's technically, no, that's not a mistake. In XML, you can actually repeat. And I will show you even examples of that, of how it's common practice, because we like to use these as lists of things. For example, if you have a list of expenses, you could have multiple expense tags, one after the other, and in XML, it's totally fine. In JSON, you would use an array of objects to do the same thing, but in XML, it's totally fine to do that. And typically what you do is that you use a plural form for the parent elements, and then the singular form to list them. For example, you might, if you want a list of countries, you can call the parent tag countries, IES, and then you have 200 country tags, country elements with a name, right? And that's typical XML. You can see that, right? But thank you for bringing this up, because indeed I have not said that before. Anybody else? Yes? Yes? Exactly, that's not good. You shouldn't be doing that. Only the W3C working groups are allowed to do that. And it's very likely the only thing they're ever going to do with that is XMLNS, the namespaces. Anybody else? Yes, over there? So this is technically allowed. So the single quotes and double quotes for attributes, we have the choice between them, right? So this is actually fine. You cannot have, however, an unescaped single quote inside a single quoted attribute, right? Anybody else? Yes? Underscore here. So technically here, this is allowed. Remember that I said for the names, it can start with an underscore, right? You can do the same thing in Java or in C++. So I think that this one is actually allowed, right? Do you agree? Maybe? Okay. How about you? One of the double quotes, yes, exactly. Yeah, this is typically if you use Word, and really in practice, some people do, then you paste that and it gets you some Unicode special automatically changed double quote. That's not a double quote. You can look for hours, something like that, before realizing it's such a trivial thing. Yes?
I have a question. Like the ampersand copy, what was that?
Copy, that's a mistake. Yeah, so you spotted it. It doesn't exist. There's only 5, LT, GT, APOS, quotes, and AMP. So this would be in HTML, right? That you can have. It's a copyright symbol, but in XML, it doesn't exist. So you cannot do that. Yes, go ahead. Yes, I think we're... Language. Let me find it. Yeah, guide me. Left to down. Yeah, here, exactly. Yeah, so there's no quotes around it, and you need quotes. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Okay, somebody else? Yes? Exactly, this is also forbidden. Don't ask me why, it's just legacy SGML. That's a rule. Yes? Yeah, absolutely. That's forbidden as well, right? We have, which one is that? This one, text, right? So that's, oh, wait, this one? The one at the top, yes, this one. Yeah, I found it. This one and this one, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, I think that's it. But the cool thing is you can put that in Oxygen, just copy paste, put in Oxygen, and Oxygen will tell you all of the mistakes. Who already downloaded Oxygen? Right? If you haven't, you should. It's really, really useful to play around. And it tells you it can pretty print documents. I do it all the time. When I download a data set from the internet, I want to see what it looks like. I put it in Oxygen, then I press the magical combination to pretty print it. Then I immediately see with the indentation. It's the kind of things you can do, but of course it can do more than that. Okay, so this is the fixed document, even though here it's pretty advanced because I even declared copyright, but I told you that's not part of the exam material, this entity thing, right? It's just to make the point that you could technically define it, right? Okay, now, in order to wrap up, I really want to connect that back to what we said before. The idea that in the end, we want to do something more generic than tables. For JSON, I've already shown you how a table can be seen as a list of JSON objects, and you can nest tables with nested arrays of objects. Who remembers that? Right? I did it in JSON. So now let's just do the same with XML, just to give you an idea of how things would look like in XML. So typically, it's slightly different than JSON. Let me take that record right here. Remember that this is a record that associates every attribute with a value. Product is phone, price is 800, customer is John, and quantity is 1. So in XML, this is how you could do it. One element for every one of the attributes, and then you put the value as text in there. How can you put types? That's the schema validation, but that we'll see in 2 weeks, right? But technically, you put all the values here as text, and you wrap that up in a parent element like this, sale, and sale is just your one row, right? It's typically the singular version of the name of the table. For whom is that clear, right? That this is one record. Now, if I want multiple records, and now I'm coming back to who was making the comment about the title and title? It was you, right? So this is, now I'm coming back to what I explained. In XML, typically you put this plural form elements around for the entire table, and every record is typically a singular version of the same, right? So sales is the parent element, and then sale, and that every record has the same name, and within the record you have the elements like this, right? So you see it's slightly different than JSON, but this is typically what it looks like. Except that here there's no namespace, so it's not enterprise ready. But again, that's just to make my point. In practice, you would also put some namespace to that. For whom is that clear? That this XML is pretty much the same as in this table. I just put the first 4 records, of course. Okay? Now? Yes? Yeah. Yeah, I'm really considering if in the big lecture halls, we really should be using these microphones. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so for the duplicate title case, there was, one of the titles was empty. So is that, like, I'm sure that's allowed, but is that good practice to have, you know, in case we have 2 duplicate elements such as that, one of them is empty, is it really needed or not?
So do you mean as opposed to the slash at the end?
Yes. So I mean, there isn't, you know, there isn't any information in that except for the fact that it's
absolutely. So so there's 2 things. First, in your question, it doesn't matter if you use this empty tag with the slash at the end, or if you use an opening and closing tag, it's the same thing, right? So I could also have written it with a slash at the end. Now, why would you have an empty element? I'm going to take the publishing industry as an example, because what I'm showing to you here is the data-oriented XML. So you could use XML like this, just like JSON. It's totally equivalent to JSON, and that's data-oriented. Now, there is another use case of XML that JSON doesn't support, and that's the publishing industry. In the publishing industry, you can put scientific papers or books in the XML format, right? So there are several standards for doing that, DocBook, and so on. And typically, the tags there are not just in order to mark records like this. These are really tags that have to do with the semantic formatting. For example, it's like XHTML, right? You have H1 for the title, H2 for a smaller title, and then you might have a new line. So a tag, an empty tag, like would be the BR in HTML, it also exists in HTML, and that marks a new line. So typically, if you have in mind that it's a scientific paper and you want to mark new line separators, then you can have empty tags like this, right? So that can happen. But it's true that if you have records like this, an empty tag would just mean that it depends how you interpret it, right? You could interpret it as the empty string. You can interpret it as there is nothing and so on, right? Did I answer your question?
Yeah, that was
all right.
Thank you.
So now to be very clear, XML, actually JSON too, they are very generic. You can do a lot of things with that, but the same is true with C++, Java, or Scala, right? And typically what happens in practice is that even though you have a very generic language, in almost every company, you're going to have a guidance or guidelines that restrict what you can do. There is one at Google, there is one at Microsoft, and so on. Every company has their guidelines. For example, at Google, as far as I remember, it's even public, you're not allowed to use any subclasses in Java, right? You can use interfaces, but not subclasses. So typically, you have the language that is very permissive, but then you only use a subset. It's the same thing with XML and JSON, right? Technically, you can do a huge mess in XML or JSON, but you really, to keep your sanity and really cleanly work with data, you really should follow patterns like this when you actually use it, right? And that's very clear to read, right? Okay. So XML and JSON allow you to do that sort of things. And XML additionally supports the publishing industry use case for papers with additional formatting. Okay, so now I did the same thing again with this table. I could have put a namespace in there, but I just didn't want to annoy you with that. If you're enterprise ready, you would need a namespace. And this here is just this table here as a list of records. Who sees that this is the same? Okay, I just pretty printed it because it's a good idea to pretty print things. All right, so we'll take a break. There's only 4 slides left, and then I'll move over to the wine column store. So I'll see you at 3:15 for the break. Thank you.